I'd like to talk to you today about the wounds that adult children of alcoholics carry with them that many don't even know exists. And I firmly believe that this is the problem. When you've been wounded as the adult child of an alcoholic, because the wounds are inside, sometimes even the victim of the wounds, of the dysfunction of alcoholism, doesn't acknowledge just how pained they truly are. If adult children of alcoholics wore their bruises on the outside and they went through life with black eyes or battered skin or bite marks on their necks or their arms or their legs, or if the skin on their back was ripped open from some type of a leather strap, then the world would be up in arms over the abuse that an adult child of an alcoholic had to tolerate as children. And we would get so much more validation and we would feel so much more real. Coming from where my family environment, my parents were both adult children of alcoholics. And because neither one of them drank to excess, it was sort of presumed in my home that alcohol really wasn't alcohol was not an issue, because my parents, when they had my sister, my brother, and I, assumed that because they didn't drink, they were much better off than their own parents. And in many, many ways that's valid, because I honor my parents because they didn't drink, because it would have been very, very easy for them to pick up a bottle of Bailey's or to pick up a bottle of scotch, because that's what my grandparents did. And unfortunately, my parents lived in filth, in squalor, especially my mom. Her family had her living above a bar her entire childhood, so that my parents could be close to alcohol. And it was a very dysfunctional way of growing up. And sadly, my mother and her two brothers didn't know any better. So what happened in her life was she was neglected, she was abandoned emotionally, but unfortunately, in her mind, she learned to believe that that was normal, that that's how everyone lived, this disconnect to self. So when my mom had me at 19, that was a part of her subconscious belief system that, it's normal to be disconnected from self. So it was impossible for her to connect to me. How could she, who doesn't have a connection to self, ever connect to me? And then the interesting thing that happened in my life was that felt so not real, not valid, and not normal to the child I was. I knew there was something wrong, and I internalized it. I'm not so sure my mother ever got to that point where she internalized this rejection and this abandonment as as a means of saying to herself that I'm no good. Mom doesn't love me, or I don't feel connected to mom because I'm no good. I feel rejected. I don't think my mom ever consciously acknowledged that. But for whatever reason, I came into this time-space reality feeling that there was something wrong with me. The disconnect between my mother and I felt so abnormal and so wrong that the child self that I was internalized it and thought, I'm bad. This disconnect that I feel has everything to do with me not being enough. And that one emotion, that one sense, that one knowing became an imprint on my brain. And it became the blueprint for the rest of my life. And I set out in life and attracted unto myself and into my experience every single day, probably in every moment, a situation and or circumstance and or person that validated that unconscious belief, that unconscious knowing that I wasn't enough. And what happened was it created a loop in my mind, and it became a loop in my life. I was not enough, and so I attracted people that weren't enough. And then I would attempt to, do something like finish school or finish a project or finish a relationship or give my all in something, and inevitably I would abandon the project, abandon the school, abandon the relationship, find fault within myself, find fault within others, and then end up feeling, after everything fell apart, you see, I'm not enough. This is all my fault. And I never made the connection until my life really fell apart and I had 3 little children to take care of. My marriage went bust. It dissolved. And I was at a point in my life where physically I was dying. I had asthma, I had migraine headaches, I was getting tunnel vision, parts of my body were going numb. I had rashes that they could not name. The doctors were baffled by what was happening inside of me. And when I went into therapy and my therapist said to me, "You're not crazy, but you are severely codependent. You worry way too much about what other people think about you, and you're on search for this validation that the people that you're attracting into your life will never give you. It's their agenda not to give it to you because they have their own issues." You see, because when you're codependent, you cannot attract healthy individuals. They won't stick around, or you will sabotage the relationship and push the other person away. So when my therapist told me that I was severely codependent, I ran with that. I wanted to know everything there was to know about codependency and how to heal it and how to recover from it. And it set me off on a journey that changed my life. Unfortunately, when I went back to my husband and said, "Look, I figured this out. We have this issue between us called codependency. You have your own set of belief systems that comes from your family history, and I have mine. But if we come together and we challenge this and we, pull our strengths together and we uplift one another and we support one another on this road towards healing codependency and what makes us codependent, we have a shot." Unfortunately, my ex-husband told me that he had no interest in changing. He liked things the way they were, which meant he liked being served. He liked me being subservient. He enjoyed not having to contribute to the relationship. He enjoyed me taking care of everything, enabling him, catering him. And it stifled me as a person emotionally, spiritually, physically. It was literally killing me on every level of my being. And so I needed to make a decision, and I chose life. And it was very difficult starting over. My family really didn't understand what I was doing because I was doing something no one in my family ever did, and that was loving self. That was believing in self. Because when you're the adult child of an alcoholic, you don't know how to love self because you're so disconnected from self. So the idea of taking care of self is foreign, and unfortunately, it's seen as something that is selfish. It is something that's negative. My mother would never go and get a pedicure or a manicure or buy herself a nice dress or sexy underwear or a lacy bra. She just would not do those things for herself. In her head, her programming is that's selfish. And so on my journey, I needed to confront all those unconscious belief systems and challenge them, look at them head on, and then decide for myself what belief systems do I want to govern my life. Because the reality is most people are living by default and assume they have no control over the direction in their life. And that is just so wrong. We are creating our reality as we go. And this is what Eckhart Tolle is speaking about when he says the now. The now. The power is in the now. The thoughts you think now are creating your tomorrow. If you unconsciously believe you are not enough, guaranteed tomorrow will bring a circumstance, a situation, a conversation, an experience on television or whatever that will help validate within you that sense of not enoughness. And then what will happen is people who are living by default, who are unconscious, will assume that the neighbor next door is wrong because they said something to make you feel like you're not enough. And that's just not the way it works. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So when you learn to surrender to self and you know in your heart and you learn that you are enough and all this other stuff is just nonsense, it's faulty programming, and when you learn to understand that within you is the power of free will, you get to choose what you want to think. You get to choose what you want to believe. And when you start invoking that right to choose, your life begins to change. So if you come away with anything today, it's that. Know that you have within you the power to change.